I never thought my life would become a legal battlefield over a barn. But here I was, standing in my attorney's office in rural Kentucky, staring at a stack of threatening letters from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. My name is Scott Finnegan, and I had moved to this supposedly peaceful property outside of Lexington 3 years ago, seeking the quiet life after decades of city stress. The place came with 15 acres, a modest farmhouse, and a beautiful old barn that had seen better days. When I bought it, nobody said a word about paint colors or architectural guidelines. The HOA was practically dormant back then, just a formality mentioned in passing during closing. Then Patricia Cunningham moved into the neighborhood. Patricia was everything you would expect from a stereotype come to life. Mid-40s, blonde highlights that screamed expensive salon, always wearing athleisure despite never actually exercising, and carrying an oversized designer bag that probably cost more than my first car. She had inherited her grandmother's house 2 miles down the road and immediately decided that her life's purpose was to resurrect the dead HOA and make everyone's existence miserable. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. I was having my coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the hills in shades of orange and gold, when my mailman, Jerry, handed me the certified envelope with an apologetic look. "Sorry, Scott. This looks like trouble," he said, shaking his head. I tore it open and read the contents, my blood pressure rising with each word. The letter, printed on fancy letterhead that probably cost a fortune, informed me that my barn was in violation of the Meadowbrook Estates Architectural Guidelines, Section 4.2, which apparently mandated that all external structures be painted in earth tones from an approved color palette. The barn, currently a weathered gray from decades of exposure, needed to be painted within 60 days or I would face daily fines of $200. The kicker: the letter included a paint swatch, beige. Not just any beige, but something they called desert sand, which looked like the color of despair and conformity had a baby. I immediately called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. A chirpy voice answered after 2 rings. "Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, this is Brenda speaking. How may I assist you today? This is Scott Finnegan from 4782 Willow Creek Road. I just received a letter about my barn and there must be some mistake. One moment, please." I heard typing, then Brenda came back on the line. "Yes, Mr. Finnegan. The board conducted an inspection of all properties last week. Your barn is currently unpainted and in violation of our guidelines." Unpainted? It's a 100-year-old barn. It's supposed to look weathered. That's part of its charm. And I was never given any guidelines when I purchased the property. All residents are required to comply with HOA regulations, regardless of when they purchased. The guidelines were updated and passed by the board last month. Who exactly is on this board? Currently, we have President Patricia Cunningham, Vice President Linda Morrison, and Secretary Karen Walsh. Of course, 3 middle-aged women with too much time and too little purpose had decided to make my barn their personal crusade. I want to speak to Patricia Cunningham directly. I can schedule you for the next board meeting, which is 3 weeks from Thursday. 3 weeks. Your letter gives me 60 days to comply, and you want me to wait 3 weeks just to discuss it. Those are our procedures, sir. I hung up, frustrated but not defeated. I was not going to let some power-hungry HOA dictate what I did with my property. I spent the next few days researching property law, HOA regulations, and my original purchase documents. What I discovered was interesting. When I had bought the property, the HOA was indeed mentioned, but it had been classified as inactive due to lack of participation. According to Kentucky law, An HOA needed to maintain certain requirements to remain active, including regular meetings, proper elections, and notification of all members regarding rule changes. I had received none of this. I called my neighbor, Robert Chen, who had lived in the area for 20 years. Robert was a retired engineer who kept meticulous records of everything. "Scott, I'm so glad you called," Robert said when I reached him. "I got the same letter about my property shed. They want me to tear down the rose trellis my wife built before she passed because it's not on the approved structures list. Are you going to comply?" "Hell no. My Linda built that with her own hands. It's staying up even if I have to chain myself to it." "Did you get any notice about HOA elections or rule changes?" "Nothing. Patricia just showed up at Linda Morrison's house one day, and the next thing we know, there's a new board and new rules. I don't think any of it is legal. Want to fight this together?" "Absolutely." Robert and I spent the next week contacting every property owner in the subdivision. Out of the 43 properties, 31 owners were blindsided by the sudden HOA activation and rule changes. We organized a meeting at my place, using the barn that Patricia wanted beige as our gathering spot. The turnout was impressive. 24 property owners showed up, along with several spouses and concerned residents. We sat on hay bales and lawn chairs while I outlined what I had discovered. According to Kentucky Revised Statutes, Chapter 382, an HOA must provide written notice to all members at least 30 days before any rule change vote, I explained, holding up my research. They must also hold proper elections with a quorum present. Did anyone here receive notice of elections? The crowd murmured negative responses. Did anyone receive notice of rule change proposals? More negative responses. Then I don't believe this HOA activation is legal, I concluded. I think we should fight this. Martha Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had lived in the area since the subdivision was created, raised her hand. "I was at the original HOA formation 30 years ago. We created it just as a formality for the county, to handle road maintenance and snow removal. The rules were simple. Don't create a nuisance, keep your property reasonably maintained, and contribute $50 a year for road repairs. That's it. I don't know where these new rules came from." "I do," said Thomas Murphy, a lawyer who lived on the east side of the development. I pulled the public records at the county clerk's office. Patricia Cunningham, Linda Morrison, and Karen Walsh filed paperwork declaring themselves the board after a so-called emergency meeting. The meeting minutes show only the 3 of them present. They then voted to adopt a completely new set of bylaws, including these architectural guidelines. "Can they do that?" someone asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not legally. They needed a quorum of homeowners, which according to our original bylaws is at least 20% of property owners. 3 people out of 43 is not a quorum." "So what do we do?" Robert asked. "We fight," I said. "We send them a formal letter explaining that we don't recognize the new board or the new rules. We demand proper elections and proper procedures, and if they refuse, we take them to court." The group agreed unanimously. Thomas volunteered to draft the letter, and we all signed it. We sent it certified mail to Patricia, Linda, and Karen, along with copies to the county clerk and the state HOA regulatory office. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days later, Patricia showed up at my property in her white Mercedes SUV, flanked by Linda and Karen in their own expensive vehicles. They looked like a suburban invasion force. I was working on my barn's foundation when they pulled up, trying to shore up some rotting boards before I even considered painting anything. Patricia got out of her car wearing high heels completely inappropriate for a farm property, and picked her way across my gravel driveway like she was walking through a minefield. "Mr. Finnegan, we need to talk," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I set down my hammer and stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Patricia, ladies, what can I do for you? You can stop spreading lies about the HOA board and comply with the guidelines like everyone else," Patricia said, her face already turning red. "We have every legal right to enforce these rules." "Actually, you don't," I replied calmly. "Your so-called election was invalid. You didn't notify the membership, you didn't have a quorum, and you didn't follow proper procedures." "We followed the emergency protocols in the bylaws," Linda interjected. She was a shorter woman with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. "Which bylaws? The original ones or the ones you three wrote yourselves?" Karen, the quietest of the three, finally spoke up. "This is ridiculous. We're just trying to maintain property values. Your ugly barn brings down the entire neighborhood's appeal." "My ugly barn was here long before any of you, and it'll be here long after. This property has historic value. The barn was built in 1924 by the original homesteader family." "We don't care about history," Patricia snapped. "We care about maintaining standards. Now, are you going to paint the barn beige or not?" Something in her entitled tone, the way she stood on my property making demands, made my decision for me. I had been debating what to do, whether to fight or compromise. But in that moment, looking at her smug face, I knew exactly what I was going to do. "I'll paint the barn," I said slowly, "but not beige. The guidelines specify earth tones from the approved palette," Patricia said, holding up her phone to show me a PDF document. "Desert sand, warm taupe, soft gray, or aged cream, those are your options. Show me where my signature appears agreeing to those guidelines." "Your signature isn't required. The HOA board votes on behalf of all residents. A board that was illegally elected doesn't have that authority." Patricia's face was now fully red, her nostrils flaring. "Paint the barn an approved color in the next 57 days, or the fines start. $200 per day, Mr. Finnegan. That adds up quickly. Send me the bills. I'll see you in court." They left in a convoy of angry German engineering and kicked up gravel dust. I watched them go, then pulled out my phone and called Thomas Murphy. "Thomas, they're going to start issuing fines. How do we handle this?" "Don't pay them," he advised. "Let them pile up. It'll help our case that they're overreaching." "But Scott, if you're really going to paint that barn, maybe pick something that won't provoke them further while we fight this in court." "Too late for that," I said, grinning. "I just decided on the color." I drove into Lexington that afternoon and went to the biggest home improvement store I could find. I walked straight to the paint department and found exactly what I was looking for. The paint specialist, a young woman named Amanda, helped me calculate how much I would need for the barn's exterior. "That's a lot of paint," she said, looking at my order. "Must be a big project." "Biggest one of my life," I agreed. "How long until you can have this ready?" "For this quantity we'll need 2 days. Is this for a commercial project?" "Personal, very personal." I placed the order and paid extra for delivery. While I waited for the paint to arrive, I started preparing the barn's surface. The old wood needed cleaning and some minor repairs, but it was structurally sound. Robert came over to help, along with a few other neighbors who had signed the letter to the HOA. "What color are you going with?" Robert asked as we power washed the barn's exterior. "You'll see when the paint arrives. As long as it's not beige, I'm happy." The paint was delivered on Friday afternoon. The delivery driver helped me unload bucket after bucket, stacking them in my garage. Each bucket had a label with my chosen color. When Robert saw them, he burst out laughing. "Fire engine red. Scott, you're going to give Patricia a heart attack." That's the idea, I said, unable to stop grinning. She wanted me to paint it. I'm painting it. Word spread quickly through our neighborhood alliance. By Saturday morning, I had 10 volunteers show up with brushes, rollers, and ladders. Martha brought homemade sandwiches. Thomas brought his portable speaker and a playlist of classic rock. Someone else brought a cooler full of beer for when we finished for the day. We started painting at sunrise. The barn's weathered gray wood drank up the primer we applied first, and then we started with the red. It was the brightest, boldest, most unapologetic shade of red I had ever seen. It practically glowed in the morning sun. "This is the most fun I've had in years," Martha said, carefully painting around a window frame. "My late husband would have loved this. He hated busybodies." By noon, we had completed one full side of the barn. The transformation was stunning. The barn went from a forgotten relic to an impossible-to-miss landmark. You could probably see it from space, or at least from Patricia's house, 2 miles away. We took a lunch break, sitting in the shade and admiring our work. That's when I saw the white Mercedes SUV speeding up my driveway, followed by another car I didn't recognize. Patricia practically leaped from her vehicle, her face matching the barn's new color. Linda and Karen emerged more slowly, both looking shocked. The fourth person was a man in his 50s wearing a polo shirt with the county logo on it. "What have you done?" Patricia screamed. "What have you done to that barn?" "I painted it like you demanded," I said calmly, taking a bite of my sandwich. "Not red. Nobody paints a barn red anymore. This is hideous. This is a violation." "Actually, madam, red is a very traditional barn color," the county official said, looking uncomfortable. "I'm Dale Harrison from the county zoning office. Mrs. Cunningham called me claiming there was a code violation occurring." "There is," Patricia insisted. "Look at that monstrosity." Dale walked closer to the barn, examining it carefully. He pulled out a tablet and checked something, then took a few photos. "Sir, do you own this property?" he asked me. "I do. Scott Finnegan. The deed's on file at the courthouse." "And this barn, was it here when you purchased the property?" "Yes, since 1924 according to the historical records." Dale nodded, typing notes. "The structure is actually listed as a contributing element to the county's rural heritage inventory. As such, maintaining and painting it is encouraged." He turned to Patricia. "Mrs. Cunningham, there's no violation here. Red is a historically accurate color for barns. In fact, red was the most common barn color in America for over 100 years because it was the cheapest paint to make." "But the HOA guidelines," Patricia started. "HOA guidelines can't supersede county encouragement of historic preservation," Dale interrupted. "If anything, Mr. Finnegan is doing exactly what we'd hope property owners would do with these old structures. Mrs. Cunningham, please don't waste county resources on frivolous complaints." He nodded to me, got back in his vehicle, and left. Patricia looked like she might spontaneously combust. "This isn't over," she hissed. "The HOA will fine you until you can't afford to live here." "Bring it on," I replied. "By the way, you're trespassing. I didn't invite you here." She opened her mouth to respond, but Thomas stood up from where he had been eating. "Ladies, I'm Thomas Murphy, attorney at law. If you proceed with these fines, I'm prepared to file a lawsuit on behalf of Mr. Finnegan and 30 other homeowners challenging the legitimacy of your board. We'll also be seeking damages for harassment and requesting an injunction against any further HOA actions until the court resolves the matter." "Do you really want to go down that road?" Linda and Karen exchanged worried looks. Patricia's jaw was clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," she finally said, turning on her heel and stomping back to her Mercedes. After they left, the volunteers and I finished painting the barn. It took us the entire weekend, but by Sunday evening, the barn was completely transformed. It was magnificently, gloriously, defiantly red. It stood against the green Kentucky hills like a middle finger to conformity and petty tyranny. I took photos from every angle as the sun set, the red paint seeming to glow in the golden hour light. I posted them on social media with the caption, "Historic barn preservation complete. Thanks to everyone who helped." The post went viral locally. By Monday morning, I had 3 news outlets calling me for interviews. The Lexington Herald-Leader sent a reporter and photographer out that afternoon. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, was fascinated by the story. "So the HOA demanded you paint it beige and you chose red instead." "They demanded I paint it according to their guidelines. I chose to paint it according to historical accuracy and personal preference." Red barns are an American tradition. And they're threatening to fine you. They're threatening to fine a lot of people. This isn't just about my barn. It's about a self-appointed board trying to exert control over a community that never agreed to their rules. The article came out on Wednesday, front page of the local section, with a beautiful photo of my red barn against the blue sky. The headline read, "Rural Homeowner Fights HOA Overreach with Historic Red Barn." The article detailed the entire conflict, including interviews with other affected homeowners and an explanation of the questionable HOA board election. The response was overwhelming. I received calls and emails from people all over Kentucky sharing their own HOA horror stories. Local news stations picked up the story. By Friday, I had been interviewed on 3 different television stations, and the barn had become a minor tourist attraction. People were driving by to take photos. Then the fines started arriving. Patricia sent me a certified letter informing me that I owed $14,000 for 70 days of violations at $200 per day. The math did not even make sense since I had only been given 60 days to comply and had painted the barn within that time frame. But facts had never seemed to matter to Patricia. I forwarded the fine letter to Thomas, who added it to our growing case file. He had been busy. In the 2 weeks since the barn painting, he had filed a comprehensive lawsuit in Fayette County Circuit Court challenging the HOA board's legitimacy, their rule changes, and their authority to issue fines. He had also filed for a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any action against homeowners until the case was resolved. The hearing for the temporary restraining order was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late April. I dressed in my best suit, feeling uncomfortable but determined. The courthouse in Lexington was an imposing building, all marble and authority, but I had truth on my side. Thomas met me outside the courtroom. Patricia hired quite an attorney, Marcus Whitfield from Louisville. He specializes in HOA law. Should I be worried? Not at all. He specializes in defending HOAs, but our case is solid. She's just trying to intimidate us with expensive legal representation. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. At least 15 of my neighbors had shown up for support, filling several rows of benches. Patricia, Linda, and Karen sat on the opposite side with their attorney, Marcus Whitfield, who looked like he charged $500 an hour just to breathe. Judge Margaret Foster entered, and we all stood. She was in her 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. After we were seated, she reviewed the case documents silently for a few minutes. "This is regarding a homeowners association dispute in Meadowbrook Estates," she finally said. "Mr. Murphy, you're requesting a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from enforcing certain rules and fines. Please present your argument." Thomas stood and laid out our case methodically. He presented the original HOA bylaws, showing their limited scope. He presented evidence that no proper election had occurred. He presented documentation that no notice of rule changes had been sent to homeowners. He presented the timeline of Patricia's takeover of the dormant HOA and the subsequent harassment of residents. "Your Honor, this isn't a legitimate HOA board," Thomas concluded. "This is 3 residents who decided to impose their will on an entire community without following any legal procedures. The fines being issued have no basis in properly enacted rules, and continuing to allow this harassment while the case proceeds would cause irreparable harm to the affected homeowners." Marcus Whitfield stood up, his expensive suit practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor, the HOA board followed emergency procedures outlined in the original bylaws." "Which emergency?" Judge Foster interrupted. "What was the nature of the emergency that required bypassing standard election procedures?" Whitfield hesitated. "The emergency was the lack of active board leadership, Your Honor. And this emergency required immediate action without notifying the other 40 homeowners. The board believed swift action was necessary to prevent property value decline." Judge Foster leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Whitfield, I've reviewed the original bylaws. The emergency clause appears to refer to natural disasters, infrastructure failure, or immediate safety hazards. I don't see how a lack of board leadership falls under that definition." "Your Honor, the board was acting in good faith. Good faith requires following established procedures," the judge said. She looked at the documents again, then at Patricia and her companions. "Mrs. Cunningham, can you explain why no notice was sent to other homeowners before these rule changes were enacted?" Patricia stood up, despite her attorney trying to pull her back down. "Your Honor, someone needed to take charge. The neighborhood was becoming an eyesore. People were letting their properties go, painting things inappropriate colors, not maintaining standards. We were trying to protect property values. By imposing rules without community input or proper procedures, we were going to hold a general meeting eventually. We just needed to establish the rules first. That's not how HOAs work, Mrs. Cunningham. That's not how democracy works." Judge Foster spent another moment reviewing the documents, then looked up. "I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA board is prohibited from enforcing any rules enacted after March 1st of this year, and all fines issued under those rules are suspended pending the outcome of the full trial. Additionally, I'm ordering that a proper HOA election be held within 60 days, with notice sent to all property owners at least 30 days in advance." Thomas squeezed my shoulder. We had won the first battle. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Marcus Whitfield wisely kept her seated. After Judge Foster left the courtroom, my neighbors surrounded me, offering congratulations and relief. Many of them had been losing sleep over the threatened fines and forced property changes. We celebrated that evening at my place, gathering around the red barn that had started it all. Someone had brought champagne. Martha brought a cake decorated with a tiny red barn and frosting. Robert gave a toast to Scott and his barn and to standing up to petty tyrants. Everyone cheered, and for a moment everything felt perfect. Then my phone rang. It was Jerry, my mailman. "Scott, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. Patricia Cunningham just mailed out letters to every house in Meadowbrook Estates. Big envelopes, probably legal stuff. I thought you should know." "Thanks, Jerry. I owe you a beer." The letters arrived the next day. Patricia had indeed sent something to everyone, but it was not legal documents. It was a 4-page manifesto about the importance of property standards, the dangers of letting neighborhoods decline, and a lengthy explanation of why she and her board had every right to enforce rules. At the bottom, she urged residents to contact the court and express support for the HOA board. The letter had exactly the opposite effect she intended. Instead of rallying support, it galvanized opposition. I received calls from homeowners who had been on the fence about the conflict, but were now firmly on my side. Patricia's condescending tone and self-righteous attitude had turned even neutral residents against her. "She actually compared your red barn to urban blight," one neighbor told me, laughing. A historic barn painted a traditional color is apparently equivalent to abandoned buildings and crime. The woman has lost her mind. The mandated HOA election approached. Thomas helped us organize a slate of candidates who actually represented the community's values. Robert Chen agreed to run for president. Martha Rodriguez, despite her age, agreed to be vice president. Thomas volunteered to be secretary. Several other reasonable neighbors stepped up for the remaining board positions. Patricia, Linda, and Karen naturally ran for re-election. The campaign, if you could call it that, was bizarre. Patricia put up signs around the neighborhood saying, "Vote for standards and keep Meadowbrook beautiful." Someone, not me but I had my suspicions, put up competing signs saying, "Vote for freedom" and "Your property, your choice." The election meeting was held on a Saturday evening at the community center in Lexington, a neutral location that could accommodate everyone. 41 of the 43 property owners showed up, the highest attendance in the HOA's 30-year history. Patricia tried to control the meeting from the start, standing at the podium and calling for order like she was still in charge. Thomas politely but firmly reminded her that, under the court order, she had no authority until properly elected. According to Kentucky HOA law and our original bylaws, any member in good standing can moderate the election, Thomas said. I propose that Martha Rodriguez, as our longest-standing resident, should oversee the voting process. The motion passed with 38 votes in favor. Patricia looked furious but had no choice but to step down from the podium. Martha ran a fair and efficient election. Each candidate was allowed 3 minutes to speak. Patricia used her time to argue that strict standards were necessary for property values and financial security. Linda and Karen echoed her points with slightly different wording. When it was Robert's turn, he kept it simple. "I've lived here for 20 years. I've seen this community thrive not because of strict rules, but because of good neighbors. If elected, I promise transparent governance, reasonable rules developed with community input, and respect for individual property rights within sensible limits. That's it." The vote was not even close. Robert won the presidency with 36 votes. Martha won vice president with 34. Thomas won secretary unanimously after running unopposed. Patricia received 5 votes total. Linda got 4. Karen got 3. The defeat was total and humiliating. Patricia stood up in the middle of the vote counting and walked out, Linda and Karen trailing behind her. We could hear her Mercedes peel out of the parking lot. "Well," Martha said, watching them go, "I suppose that's that." But it was not that, not by a long shot. The main lawsuit was still pending, with a trial date set for July. Patricia and her allies, though no longer on the HOA board, were still defendants in the case. We were seeking damages for harassment, reimbursement of legal fees, and a permanent injunction preventing them from ever serving on the HOA board again. As spring turned to summer, my red barn became something of a local landmark. A regional magazine did a feature on historic barn preservation, using my barn as the cover photo. Tourism websites started listing it as a scenic photo opportunity. I even had a family from Indiana stop, by asking if they could have a picnic on my property because their grandmother had grown up on a farm with a red barn just like mine. Life was good, but I knew Patricia was not done. People like her did not go quietly. I just did not expect what came next. In mid-June, Robert called me sounding shaken. "Scott, someone vandalized the new HOA mailbox we installed at the community entrance. Spray painted it with obscenities, and there's more. Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the county claiming your barn is structurally unsafe and should be condemned." "What?" "Dale from the county was just here in March. He saw the barn. It's completely sound." "I know, but they're required to investigate every complaint." "Dale called me to give you a heads up. He'll be by tomorrow morning to do an inspection." Dale arrived at 9 the next morning, looking apologetic. "Scott, I know this is nonsense, but I have to follow through." Someone filed a detailed complaint claiming the barn has foundation issues, roof problems, and poses a danger to the public. "The public that comes onto my private property." Their words, not mine. "Let's just do a thorough inspection so I can close the file." We spent 2 hours going over every inch of the barn. Dale brought in a structural engineer colleague to verify his findings. Their conclusion was what I already knew. The barn was structurally sound, properly maintained, and posed no danger to anyone. "I'll file my report today," Dale said. Whoever made that complaint was either mistaken or deliberately lying. Given the detail in the complaint, though, they clearly have some knowledge of building codes. They knew exactly what to claim to trigger a mandatory inspection. Could it have been Patricia Cunningham? I can't discuss who filed the complaint, but I will say that the email came from a free email service, not a personal account. Someone was trying to remain anonymous. After Dale left, I sat on my porch and looked at the barn. It really was beautiful. The red paint had weathered slightly over the past few months, taking on a richer, deeper tone that only made it more striking against the landscape. But Patricia's vendetta was escalating beyond HOA disputes into something more personal and potentially criminal. I called Thomas and explained the situation. "False reports to government agencies can be prosecuted, but it's hard to prove who made an anonymous complaint," he said. "However, if we can establish a pattern of harassment, it could help our civil case. Document everything." The trial began on July 15th. The Fayette County Courthouse was packed. Word had spread about the case, and it had attracted attention from HOA reform advocates across the state. Several reporters were in attendance, and I even noticed a camera crew from a Louisville television station. Judge Foster was again presiding. Both legal teams presented their opening statements. Thomas laid out a clear narrative of HOA overreach, illegal procedures, and targeted harassment. Marcus Whitfield argued that his clients were well-meaning volunteers trying to protect property values who had made some procedural errors, but acted in good faith. The trial lasted 3 days. Thomas called witness after witness, homeowners who testified about threatened fines, harassment, and the intimidation tactics used by Patricia's board. Robert testified about the rose trellis his late wife had built. Martha testified about the HOA's original limited purpose. I testified about the barn and the escalating conflict. The most dramatic moment came when Thomas presented evidence about the anonymous complaint to the county. He had subpoenaed email records and traced the complaint back to an IP address. With the help of a forensic technology expert, he showed that the IP address belonged to Linda Morrison's home network. Patricia, Linda, and Karen sat stone-faced through most of the testimony, but Linda visibly paled when her email account was connected to the false complaint. Marcus Whitfield tried to defend his clients, arguing that even if the complaint was made by Linda, it was legitimate concern, not malicious harassment. But the county inspector's testimony undermined that argument. Dale explained in detail why the complaint was not just wrong but specifically crafted to sound credible while being factually false. In my professional opinion, Dale testified, whoever wrote that complaint knew enough about building codes to make serious allegations, but anyone who actually looked at the barn would know those allegations were false. It was designed to waste county resources and harass Mr. Finnegan. Judge Foster asked Linda directly if she had filed the complaint. Under oath, Linda hesitated, then admitted she had. "Why?" the judge asked. "Because that barn is an eyesore," Linda said quietly. "It doesn't fit the neighborhood. We were trying to help by filing a false report. We thought if the county condemned it, the problem would be solved." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Judge Foster called for order. On the third day, Judge Foster delivered her ruling. She found that Patricia, Linda, and Karen had indeed violated proper HOA procedures, had harassed homeowners, and had overstepped any legitimate authority they might have had. She ordered them to pay damages to each affected homeowner, reimburse all legal fees, and permanently barred them from serving on the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board in any capacity. Furthermore, she ordered Linda Morrison to pay an additional $10,000 in punitive damages to me, specifically for the false complaint to the county. This court takes seriously any attempt to misuse government resources for personal vendettas, Judge Foster said sternly. Mrs. Morrison, you are fortunate that the county has chosen not to pursue criminal charges, though they would be within their rights to do so. We had won. Completely and totally won. The courtroom erupted in applause from my neighbors and the HOA reform advocates who had attended. Patricia stood up and left without a word, followed by Linda and Karen. I noticed that Linda was crying outside the courthouse. Reporters surrounded us. Thomas gave a statement about the importance of HOA accountability and proper governance. Robert talked about protecting individual property rights within reasonable community standards. I simply said that I was glad to get back to enjoying my property in peace. That evening, we held a massive celebration at my farm. Nearly everyone from Meadowbrook Estates showed up, along with friends, family, and supporters from around the area. Someone had brought a band. Tables of food covered my front yard. Kids played in the field while adults drank and laughed and shared stories. The red barn stood proudly in the background of every photo taken that night, a symbol of resistance and victory. But the story was not quite over. 2 weeks after the trial, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. Mr. Finnegan. This is Detective Sarah Collins with the Lexington Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about Patricia Cunningham. My stomach dropped. What's happened? Could you come to the station? It's important. I drove to the police station with a sense of dread. Despite everything, I did not want Patricia to be hurt or in serious trouble. I just wanted her to leave me alone. Detective Collins was a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and a coffee-stained notebook. She led me to an interview room and explained the situation. Patricia Cunningham has been arrested, she said. We're investigating multiple incidents of vandalism, trespassing, and making terroristic threats. Terroristic threats. Several residents of Meadowbrook Estates have received threatening letters over the past week. The letters suggested that properties would be damaged or destroyed if owners didn't comply with certain demands. We were able to trace the letters back to Mrs. Cunningham through fingerprints and DNA on the envelopes. I was stunned. I never received any letters. No, you didn't. My theory is that she knew you would immediately report them and they could be traced. She targeted people she thought would be intimidated into silence. We only found out because one of the recipients, a Martha Rodriguez, came forward. Martha. Of course, she had not been intimidated. Additionally, we have evidence that Mrs. Cunningham or someone acting on her behalf damaged property belonging to Robert Chen last week. His rose trellis was destroyed with a chainsaw at 3 in the morning. A neighbor's security camera caught footage. Please tell me you can see who did it. We can't identify the person clearly, but we can identify the vehicle. It's registered to Patricia Cunningham. She claims the vehicle was stolen that night, but she never filed a police report. We're fairly confident she either did it herself or had someone do it on her behalf. The charges were serious: vandalism, criminal mischief, terroristic threatening, and filing a false police report about the allegedly stolen vehicle. If convicted on all counts, Patricia could face several years in prison. I need to ask you some questions about your interactions with Mrs. Cunningham, Detective Collins said. Has she ever threatened you directly? I spent the next hour recounting the entire saga, from the first HOA letter to the trial. Detective Collins took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back and sighed. This is one of the stranger cases I've worked. Usually, HOA disputes stay in civil court, but Mrs. Cunningham appears to have escalated things into criminal territory. What happens now? She's being held pending arraignment. Given the nature of the charges and her apparent obsession with this matter, the prosecutor is likely to argue that she's a flight risk or could continue to harass witnesses. We'll see what the judge says. Patricia's arraignment made the local news. Her bail was set at $50,000, which she posted immediately. The trial was scheduled for October, 3 months away. In the meantime, life slowly returned to normal. Robert planted new roses around the rebuilt trellis, which several neighbors helped him reconstruct. The new HOA board held monthly meetings that were boring and efficient, exactly as they should be. We discussed road maintenance, organized a neighborhood cleanup day, and reviewed the budget. Nobody mentioned paint colors or architectural guidelines. My red barn continued to attract visitors. I eventually put up a small sign near the road. Historic Red Barn, built 1924, restored 2025. People would stop, take photos, and occasionally knock on my door to tell me they loved the barn or to share their own HOA horror stories. One couple drove from Ohio just to see it. The husband explained that they were fighting their own HOA over solar panels and had followed my case online. You gave us hope, his wife said. If you could win against people like that, maybe we can too. I gave them Thomas's contact information and wished them luck. Patricia's criminal trial in October was quick and anticlimactic compared to the civil case. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The threatening letters had her fingerprints. The damaged trellis was caught on camera being approached by her vehicle. She had no credible alibi for any of the incidents. Her attorney tried to argue that she had been under extreme stress and was not thinking clearly, but the calculated nature of the crimes worked against that defense. The letters were carefully worded to frighten without making explicit threats. The timing of the vandalism showed planning. This was not someone having a breakdown. This was someone methodically trying to punish and intimidate people she felt had wronged her. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on all counts. Linda Morrison was also charged as an accessory for the trellis vandalism after phone records showed she had been in contact with Patricia immediately before and after the incident. Karen Walsh, apparently having learned her lesson, cooperated with prosecutors and avoided charges. At sentencing, Judge Kenneth Morrison, no relation to Linda, was not sympathetic. Mrs. Cunningham, you had every legal option available to address your concerns about neighborhood standards. You could have worked within the system, followed proper procedures, and built community consensus. Instead, you chose intimidation, harassment, and ultimately criminal behavior. Your actions went far beyond a simple dispute over property rules. You terrorized your neighbors and destroyed property out of spite. He sentenced Patricia to 3 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months. Linda received 2 years, with possibility of parole after 1 year. Both were also required to pay restitution to their victims and perform community service after release. I felt no joy watching Patricia being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, just relief that it was finally over. The story had one final chapter. In November, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Torres. She had been following HOA reform efforts across the country and wanted to feature my story in her film. "Your case hit on so many important issues," she explained over coffee in Lexington. "Property rights, community governance, the abuse of power by unelected boards, and what happens when bureaucratic overreach goes too far. Plus, you have a beautiful red barn. That's great cinematography." I agreed to participate. Over the next several weeks, Rachel and her crew filmed interviews with me, Robert, Martha, Thomas, and even Dale from the county office. They filmed the barn from every angle, in every light, in every weather condition. They attended an HOA board meeting to show how the organization now functioned properly. The documentary, titled Beyond Beige, The Battle for Meadowbrook Estates, premiered at a film festival in Louisville the following spring. It won an award for Best Short Documentary and was picked up by a streaming service. Suddenly, my red barn was famous nationally. I received interview requests from newspapers, podcasts, and television shows. A few I accepted, wanting to spread the message about HOA reform. Most I declined, preferring to get back to my quiet life. The barn's fame did bring one unexpected benefit. The Kentucky Historical Society reached out about officially designating it as a historic landmark. The designation came with a small grant for ongoing maintenance and protection against future demolition or significant alteration. Ironically, Patricia Cunningham's campaign against your barn may have ensured it will be preserved forever. The Historical Society representative told me with a smile. I stood on my porch on a cool evening 1 year after I had first received that HOA letter, looking at the red barn in the fading sunlight. It had been quite a journey from that moment of irritated confusion to where I now stood. The barn looked magnificent. The red paint had aged beautifully, giving it character while maintaining that bold, defiant color that had started everything. Wildflowers had grown up around its base, and I had resisted the urge to cut them back. They added to the rustic charm. Robert walked up my driveway, carrying 2 beers. He had made it a tradition to join me on my porch a couple evenings a week. We would sit, drink, and watch the sun set over the hills without needing to say much. Good neighbors did not need constant conversation. You ever think about what would have happened if you had just painted it beige? He asked, handing me a beer. I considered the question. Sometimes, life would have been simpler, but I would have spent the rest of my days looking at that barn and knowing I had let someone push me into giving up something that mattered. I would have resented it every single day. Think Patricia regrets how things went? I doubt it. People like that rarely see themselves as the problem. In her mind, she was right and the world was wrong. That's why she escalated things to the point of criminal behavior. I heard she's up for parole next month. I heard that too. I hope she's learned something, but I'm not counting on it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another message from someone fighting their own HOA, asking for advice. I had become an accidental advocate, a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny. I replied with encouragement and Thomas's contact information, then put my phone away. The fight was important, but so was this moment, this peace, this view of my beautiful, defiant, historic red barn standing strong against the darkening sky. Martha walked up the driveway next, followed by Thomas and a few other neighbors. Apparently word had spread about the evening porch sessions, and they had become informal social gatherings. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought more beer. We talked and laughed and enjoyed each other's company as stars appeared overhead. This was what community was supposed to be. Not rules and regulations and forced conformity, but people choosing to come together, respecting each other's differences, and finding common ground through genuine connection rather than mandated compliance. The Red Barn stood watch over us all, a monument to the simple principle that sometimes you have to stand up for what is right, even when it is easier to give in. Especially when it is easier to give in. As the evening grew late and neighbors began heading home, I remained on the porch, reluctant to let the moment end. Robert stayed behind, sensing I wanted company without conversation. "You know what the funny thing is?" I finally said. "That barn needed painting when this all started. It was weathered and fading. I probably would have painted it eventually anyway, just to protect the wood. Patricia actually did me a favor by forcing the issue. She just did not like the outcome." "Life's funny that way," Robert agreed. "Sometimes the things we fight against the hardest are the things we needed all along." I thought about Patricia in prison, Linda dealing with her conviction, and Karen who had wisely stepped back before things went too far. I thought about all the HOA horror stories I had heard from people across the country. There had to be a better way to organize communities, one that balanced reasonable standards with individual freedom. The new Meadowbrook Estates HOA was trying to find that balance. We had rewritten the bylaws to be clear and limited in scope. We had established transparent processes for any rule changes, requiring approval from at least 60% of homeowners. We had created an appeals process for disputes. Most importantly, we had embraced the principle that people's homes were their castles, and any restrictions on that fundamental right needed to be carefully considered and truly necessary. It was not perfect, but it was working. Property values had not crashed despite Patricia's dire predictions. If anything, the neighborhood felt more vibrant now. People took pride in their homes because they were expressions of themselves, not because they feared fines and harassment. My phone rang. I almost did not answer, but the number showed it was Rachel, the documentary filmmaker. "Scott, I just got some incredible news," she said, excitement clear in her voice. "Beyond Beige has been selected for the Sundance Film Festival, and Netflix is interested in acquiring it for their platform. Your story is going to reach millions of people." "That's amazing, Rachel. Congratulations. This is your story as much as mine. You're going to become very recognizable. Are you ready for that?" I looked at the barn, solid and real in the moonlight. "I think so. If it helps even one person stand up to an abusive HOA, it will be worth it." After I hung up, Robert raised his beer. "To fame and fortune, to red barns and good neighbors," I countered. We clinked bottles and drank. The night grew deeper. Eventually, even Robert headed home, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my barn. I walked down to it, running my hand along the red wood. It was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and age and history. I had been slowly restoring the interior, not to change it but to preserve it. Old tools hung on the walls. The loft still had the original ladder. A family of barn owls lived in the rafters, and I left them alone. They were part of the barn's story, too. I climbed up to the loft and looked out the window toward my house. The porch light glowed welcomingly. Beyond it, I could see scattered lights from neighboring houses. Each light represented a home, a family, a life being lived according to that person's values and choices. This was America as it was supposed to be. Not uniform, not conformist, but diverse and free and beautifully chaotic. The red barn was a symbol of that freedom, a declaration that we could choose our own paths while still being good neighbors and responsible community members. The legal bills had been substantial, even with the reimbursement from Patricia and her co-defendants. The stress had taken a toll. There had been many sleepless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing, if it was all worth it over a paint color. But standing in that barn loft, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood that had come together to fight for its rights, I knew the answer. It had been worth every penny, every anxious moment, every confrontation. Some things were worth fighting for. I climbed back down and locked up the barn, then walked back to my house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emails from people fighting their own battles, probably more interview requests. But tonight, I was just Scott Finnegan, a man who owned a beautiful red barn in Kentucky, living proof that you could stand up to bullies and win. As I settled into bed, I thought about Patricia one last time. I hoped prison would give her time to reflect, to understand that communities thrive through cooperation and respect, not through control and intimidation. I hoped she would emerge a better person, one who could channel her obvious passion and energy into positive change rather than destructive crusades. But that was her journey, not mine. Mine had led me here to this peaceful moment, to this sense of accomplishment and purpose. The red barn would stand for another 100 years, maybe longer, a testament to the simple act of refusing to surrender your principles when faced with unreasonable demands. I slept better that night than I had in months, knowing that the battle was truly over and that the right side had won. In the morning, I woke to sunshine streaming through my window. I made coffee and went out to the porch, and there it was, my magnificent red barn, glowing in the morning light like a beacon of freedom and defiance. It was going to be a good day. It was going to be a good life.